There are currently over 130 armed conflicts raging around the world. This week we will be taking a detailed look at two specific sets of men and what they are facing. The psychological cost of living in a war zone, civilian men in Palestine and Ukraine. For civilians, war is not only fought on battlefields, it is fought in apartment blocks, refugee shelters, hospitals, schools, and inside the human mind. Men living in war zones such as Ukraine and Palestine often experience a form of psychological strain that is both immediate and long-lasting. While media coverage usually focuses on physical destruction and military strategy, the invisible wounds carried by civilians can persist for decades. For men in particular, war creates a collision between fear, responsibility, helplessness, grief, and social expectations of masculinity. Many are expected to protect their families while simultaneously enduring bombardment, displacement, economic collapse, and the constant possibility of death. The result is often profound psychological damage that may never fully heal. Let's get into it. 1. Living under constant threat. One of the most damaging aspects of civilian life in a war zone is the absence of safety. The nervous system is not built to remain in survival mode indefinitely. In places affected by repeated airstrikes, artillery fire, occupation, or forced displacement, the body adapts to permanent danger. Men living in these environments often develop symptoms associated with severe trauma. Hypervigilance, insomnia, panic attacks, emotional numbness, irritability and aggression, depression, survivor's guilt, post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Research involving civilians living in active conflict zones found persistently high levels of anxiety, depression, and PTSD, especially among those experiencing displacement, traumatic loss, or financial collapse. In Ukraine, civilians have spent years under missile attacks, drone strikes, blackouts, and uncertainty. Studies on Ukrainian civilians found that increased exposure to war and a constant sense of danger strongly predicted PTSD symptoms and psychological distress. The human brain begins to rewire itself in these conditions. Everyday sounds can trigger fear responses. Silence itself becomes unsettling. Men may struggle to relax even when temporarily safe because their minds remain conditioned to expect catastrophe. 2. Masculinity and the pressure to stay strong. War often intensifies traditional expectations placed on men. In many societies, men are expected to be protectors, providers, and emotionally controlled figures. During conflict, these expectations can become psychologically crushing. A father who cannot protect his children from bombs may experience deep shame and helplessness. A husband unable to provide food or medicine due to destroyed infrastructure may feel emasculated. Young men may internalize the belief that fear itself is weakness. This creates a dangerous emotional pattern. Men suppress trauma rather than process it. They avoid vulnerability. They isolate themselves emotionally. They turn to anger, alcohol, emotional detachment, or silence. In war zones, survival often depends on emotional suppression in the short term, but over time, this suppression can evolve into chronic depression, dissociation, or explosive emotional breakdowns. Many men in conflict zones also experience what psychologists call moral injury, psychological damage caused not only by fear, but by witnessing or being unable to prevent horrifying events. A civilian man who watches neighbors die, cannot save a relative, or must choose which family member to help first may carry unbearable guilt for years afterward. 3. The trauma of powerlessness. War destroys one of the core psychological foundations of mental health, personal control. Civilian men in both Ukraine and Palestine often face situations where survival depends entirely on forces beyond their control. Missiles falling randomly, sudden evacuation orders, loss of home or livelihood, separation from loved ones, arbitrary detention or occupation, lack of food, electricity, or medical care. Over time, prolonged helplessness can produce what psychologists call learned helplessness, where people begin to feel that nothing they do matters. This is strongly associated with severe depression and suicidal thinking. For men who previously defined themselves through action, competence, and responsibility, this psychological collapse can be devastating. 4. Continuous trauma versus single trauma. One important difference between war trauma and ordinary traumatic events is that war often never truly ends psychologically. A car crash or assault is a traumatic event with a beginning and an end. In long-term conflict zones, civilians may experience continuous traumatic stress. The threat remains active every day. Palestinian psychiatrist Dr. Sama Jaber has argued that standard Western definitions of PTSD do not fully capture the reality faced by Palestinians because the trauma is ongoing rather than historical. In environments where bombardment, occupation, or fear continue for years, hypervigilance is not irrational. It it becomes necessary for survival. Civilians adapt psychologically to permanent danger, but this adaptation comes at enormous emotional cost. Children raised in these environments may normalize violence entirely. Fathers witnessing this often experience another layer of grief, the feeling that their children are losing innocence before their eyes. 5. Displacement and identity loss. War does not only destroy buildings, it destroys identity. When civilians are displaced, men often lose their homes, their professions, their social status, community ties, cultural routines, a sense of belonging. A teacher becomes a refugee, a businessman becomes dependent on aid, a father sleeps in a temporary shelter, unable to provide privacy or stability for his family. Research consistently shows that forced displacement significantly increases rates of depression, PTSD, and anxiety. For many men, identity is closely tied to purpose and usefulness. War strips these away abruptly. The psychological effect can resemble mourning, not only for lost people, but for lost versions of oneself. 6. Emotional numbing and relationship damage. Many civilians surviving prolonged war report emotional numbness. This is a defense mechanism. When the brain is overwhelmed by horror, it sometimes shuts down emotional responsiveness to survive. Men may stop crying entirely. They may become detached from loved ones. Some struggle to feel joy, affection, or hope. This emotional shutdown can damage marriages, friendships, and parenting. Families already under immense pressure may begin to fracture emotionally, even while physically surviving together. Some men become emotionally unavailable because allowing themselves to fully feel grief would make daily survival impossible. 7. Anger, violence, and cycles of trauma. Untreated trauma often reappears as anger. Men living in prolonged conflict may become more aggressive, more impulsive, emotionally volatile, prone to substance abuse, desensitized to violence. This does not mean trauma inevitably creates violent people. Most traumatized civilians do not become violent, but prolonged exposure to fear and brutality can alter emotional regulation and increase the likelihood of domestic conflict, self-destructive behavior, or intergenerational trauma. Children raised by traumatized parents may inherit the psychological consequences of war, even if they themselves never experience combat directly. 8. The loneliness of male suffering. One overlooked aspect of war trauma is how invisible male suffering can become. Men are often socially rewarded for endurance and silence. In war zones, this pressure intensifies. A man breaking down emotionally may fear appearing weak when others depend on him. As a result, many civilian men suffer privately. They avoid seeking therapy. They hide panic attacks. They minimize grief. They suppress fear until it manifests physically through headaches, exhaustion, chest pain, or chronic illness. This isolation deepens the psychological wound. 9. Resilience and survival. Despite immense suffering, many civilians also display extraordinary resilience. Communities continue functioning under unimaginable conditions. Fathers carry children through rubble. Neighbors share food during shortages. Volunteers rescue strangers. Families maintain rituals, humor, and love amid destruction. Psychologists studying war zones often note that resilience does not mean the absence of trauma. It means continuing despite trauma. Many men survive because they find meaning in protecting family, preserving dignity, helping others, or maintaining hope even in devastated environments. But resilience should never be romanticized. Human beings can adapt to horrific conditions, yet still carry permanent psychological scars. Conclusion. Living in a war zone fundamentally alters the human mind. For civilian men in places like Ukraine and Palestine, war creates a relentless psychological burden shaped by fear, grief, helplessness, displacement, and social pressure to remain strong. The damage is often invisible. A man may survive physically while carrying years of anxiety, numbness, guilt, insomnia, or depression internally. Some recover partially, others never fully return to who they were before the war began. The mental health consequences of war do not end when bombs stop falling. They continue in memories, relationships, communities, and future generations. Understanding this reality is essential if societies hope to address not only the physical destruction caused by conflict, but the human devastation left behind. Let us all hope that swift and peaceful resolutions can be found to both these and all other conflicts currently consuming the world. There are better ways for us all to live, without continuous fighting and violence. Thanks for watching. See you all next time.